This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I would like to acknowledge that the University of South Australia meets on the land of the Kaurna people. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their ancestors and elders, and to acknowledge the spiritual connection they have with their traditional land. I also extend that respect to Aboriginal peoples from other areas of South Australia and Australia. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Hawke Centre, the University of South Australia and The Conversation to our first event, Crisis and Denial. I'm thrilled that we are co-presenting this wonderful online series with The Conversation, and I would like to thank Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation, and Susan Hornbeck, Strategic Partnerships Manager, for all their wonderful work. Also to thank our national and international speakers for their time and for sharing their unique knowledge. I hope that you find our new series thought-provoking and helpful, and it is now my pleasure to welcome Misha Ketchell, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Welcome to our panel discussion, looking at the common threads linking COVID-19 conspiracy theories, climate denialism, and the anti-vaccination movement. Tonight we've got a terrific panel of experts who I will introduce in just a minute, but I'll start off just with some notes on how we're going to run the format. Each panellist will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes around their area of expertise, and then what we're going to do is moderated questions from the audience. I think we've had more than 100 questions sent in by audience members. So we'll have a moderated discussion that will draw on all of your individual questions. And just to sort of foreclose on any complaints, there is no conspiracy in the selection of questions. There's a huge number of questions, so we'll only be able to talk about a few of those. To start with our panel, we've got Professor Stephan Lewandowski, who is a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol. His most recent research interest is in exploring the potential conflict between human cognition and the physics of global climate change, which has led him into collaborative research in climate science and climate modelling. We also have Professor Julie Leask, who is a social scientist in the Susan Wachtel School of Nursing and Midwifery at the University of Sydney and visiting fellow at the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance. Julie has qualifications in nursing and midwifery, a Master of Public Health, and a PhD in Public Health. Her key area of focus is vaccination and infectious disease risk communication, and she has 131 publications in these fields. Dr Carmen Lawrence is the Director of the Centre for the Study of Social Change at the University of Western Australia. She started her career as a research psychologist and was a prominent and trailblazing politician for 21 years, during which time she served as Premier and Treasurer of Western Australia and the Federal Minister for Health and Human Services. She retired from politics in 2007 and since then has been a leading researcher in the field of social change. Perhaps we can start our discussion with Stephan. Stephan, you recently released a book on conspiracy theories, a handbook, and helpfully wrote a conversation article on that topic. And in particular, you talked about some of the conspiracy theories around COVID-19. So perhaps you could start by telling us what people are saying now and what you think we should do about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I think it's not at all surprising that there are conspiracy theories out there at the moment. If there's one thing we've learned over the last 500 years or so is that any pandemic will give rise to also an outbreak of conspiracy theories. And the reason for that is that we know from a lot of research that whenever people feel that they have lost control, that they're not in control of events in their own lives, that then some of them become susceptible or are interested in conspiracy theories because they offer psychological comfort. The ironic thing about a conspiracy theory is that if you really think that there is some evil people out there who are causing this pandemic, then you can take some comfort in that, because you can at least imagine that these people could have acted differently and the world would be a different place. So it's a psychological way in which people try to restore a sense of control in their lives. So that is where it is coming from. I think the evidence for that is quite clear. And so how do you know, the next question, I guess, is how do you know that something is a conspiracy theory rather than an actual conspiracy? Because this is always the problem, that everybody says that, oh, but they're real conspiracies. So how do you know that this one isn't real? And what my research has been about for the last couple of years, in part, is to identify the cognitive markers of conspiracy theories. That is, to try to identify how people think when they become engrossed in the conspiracy narrative. And we now have 7 markers, it turns out, of conspiratorial thought. I don't want to go through them all now, obviously, but one of the things that is remarkable is that all conspiracy theories, sooner or later, turn out to be incoherent. They're contradictory. They don't hang together well. For example, in the case of COVID, there's a movie out there that is propagating this conspiracy theory where, on the one hand, we're told that the virus has been with us forever and we got it from being vaccinated as children, and it is now unleashed by us wearing masks, which of course is totally absurd to begin with. But at the same time, the same people are also saying, oh, it's a chemical weapon that was developed in Wuhan and was unleashed on the world in January. And they're holding those two beliefs at the same time. And of course, they're incoherent. Either this thing has been around forever or it was just invented in China. You can't have it both ways. And that is a consistent marker of any kind of conspiracy theory. So if you can, if you know that, then you can pay attention and detect those incoherences. And the moment you detect that, you can be pretty sure you're talking about a conspiracy theory, not something that might have actually happened, because reality is not incoherent.
Stephan, why do these theories matter? Like, what is the actual behavioral sort of problems that result from people having these types of beliefs?
Well, this is where it gets to be problematic, because we do know from laboratory research, but also from recent events, that conspiracy theories have an adverse consequence. In the laboratory, we can show that the mere exposure to a conspiracy theory makes people less engaged in politics, more distrusting, less likely to reduce their carbon footprint. Just exposure to conspiracy theories can have these detectable adverse consequences for civic engagement. And in the UK, recently, one consequence of a COVID conspiracy theory was that people were starting to blow up communications infrastructure. Something like 70 or 80 mobile phone installations have been damaged in the United Kingdom because of this rather nonsensical belief that 5G broadband is causing COVID. So it can lead to violence in the extreme case. So I think we have to take this seriously.
One thing that people often allege or raise is the idea that conspiracy theories are fed by vested interests. What's your sort of thinking on the extent to which these theories sort of are self-generating or actually the results of willful manipulation?
Oh, well, I think it's both. I think that, there are entrepreneurs out there who create conspiracy theories because it fulfills their need for attention or glamour or exposure or whatever. There's certainly, we live in an attention economy. We have to understand that. And for some people, getting clicks on YouTube is more important than anything else, because that is what they thrive on. And so, I'm sure, in fact, you can look at this online on social media in various places, and they do try out different conspiracy theories. There is a market for this nonsense, and then some go viral because they happen to find a niche that people find believable or interesting or fascinating, and then they start sharing it, and then it goes wild. And there are various examples of that. For example, the infamous Pizzagate conspiracy. I don't know if you recall that, from 2016 during the American election, where ultimately a guy with an automatic rifle went into a pizza joint and shot it up in Washington, D.C., because he learned on the internet that the Democrats are running a child sex slavery ring out of the basement of that pizza parlor. Now, the pizza parlor doesn't have a basement, for one, and number two, the entire thing was generated through nonsense that emerged from a chat room, then went onto Facebook, ultimately was retweeted by Donald Trump's son, I believe. And so it went from this, laboratory of let's just cook things up, to the point where a guy with a rifle walked into a restaurant in Washington, D.C., all based on zero evidence, as is usually the case. So there's a market out there. There's an entrepreneurial system of people who try this out for a number of different motivations. Going back to the 5G conspiracy that I just mentioned, what's interesting about that is that it was first pushed by Russia Today about 18 months ago. It had nothing at the time, had nothing to do with COVID, but pointing the finger at 5G and saying, oh my God, this is, causing all sorts of dreadful things. That was a fairly systematic propaganda effort that was launched in early 2019, and there is a paper trail for that. The New York Times covered it at the time. It was well known that this was injected into the discourse by Russia Today, because, of course, if people pick up on this stuff and then start opposing 5G, then that has consequences that some people outside the United States or the Western world might view as being positive. So there's a clear case where that was engineered, but it's generally true that things emerge from an entrepreneurial system of people just making stuff up, and they see what sticks.
And just on that, what role do you think that the technology plays in this, given that conspiracy theories have been with us for a long time? There was a famous essay written before about the paranoid style in American politics, talking about precisely this phenomenon. So to what extent is this something that the technology is sort of turbocharged?
Well, obviously there are two differences. The main difference that everybody knows about is that it's just much easier to spread things, and it's much faster. And if you're lucky to be picked up online and your conspiracy theory goes viral, then you have enormous exposure. And that is something that, 30 years ago you couldn't have done, because it was just much harder to get information out. So that's one aspect of modern technology that helps in spreading this. But there is a second consequence that, to my mind, is almost more important and is certainly less well understood. And that is the fact that we know from decades of research that people hold an opinion to the extent that they think it is widely shared by others. So people orient themselves around what other people in their environment are thinking. And if everybody around me thinks that the earth is flat, then I'm quite, sensibly believing the same thing. People are social animals, and our beliefs are shaped by what other people believe. Now, that worked really well while we didn't have social media, because we were on average pretty well calibrated to, what other people thought. And whenever somebody stood out from that, there was enormous pressure on them, even if only tacitly, to kind of be a little bit skeptical of their own opinion. If I'm the only one in my village who thinks the earth is flat, chances are that everybody else is telling me I'm the village idiot, and I will be slightly quiet in what I say. Now, here's the problem. The moment you have social media and you have Facebook with 1 billion or whatever users, that calibration no longer works, because I can go online and it doesn't matter how absurd my opinion is, whatever it is, the earth is flat. I go on Facebook and bam, all of a sudden I'm surrounded by hundreds of other people who share that view. The moment that happens, my belief is reinforced and it becomes more resistant to being changed. So in other words, what happens is that people, no matter what their belief is, they find it supported by others, which can only happen on social media, because in physical life, you would never meet those other people because there's so few of them, the chances of you encountering them are infinitesimally small. So what social media does is to provide a machine that allows anyone to find support for their opinions, feel that it's wide shared, therefore become entrenched in that opinion, and thus become resistant to changing their mind. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have so many people screaming at each other online, not being able to engage in a dialogue or changing their opinion, because they find support that in real life, in physical life, they would never find.
Okay. Perhaps that's a good opportunity to bring in Julie. Your expertise area is the anti-vaccination movement. And one thing I'm wondering is, do you feel like that movement would have gained the same momentum and traction that it has in a different technological environment? Do you think technology is playing a big part in that movement?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I started studying the anti-vaccination movement in 1997 when we were just starting to use computers. And, certainly at university, we were just starting to use them. And at the time, I was looking at their activism there. I was looking at their messages and how the anti-vaccination movements in Australia were behaving and how they were trying to affect that activism. And what I noticed was that they would engage with their local communities, like through stalls at street fairs. They would engage with their local MPs in political advocacy, and they would do things like, if they heard that a TV program was going to do a story about a child who was allegedly injured by a vaccine, they would call the producer and egg them on and provide other people to interview. So there was already activism then, and they were using newsletters and other means to communicate. And then when listservs came along, they were very quickly jumping on those and using those. So they were using whatever means they could to share their messages. And in a sense, the mode of communication was changing, and that is changing the dynamic of anti-vaccination activism, and it's changing our awareness of it as well. But the core themes were perennial. They were that, and there's sort of the idea that vaccines are poisonous chemical cocktails which cause all manner of modern ills, and that this fact is covered up through a collusion between big pharma and governments with a totalitarian agenda, and these brave whistleblowers would lay their theories Galileo-like at the door of the scientific church, and they'd be persecuted or rejected, and that it was better to get back to nature in preventing diseases. So even though the modes and manifest arguments change, the subtexts don't tend to change. And I saw them stretch back through the history of vaccination. I saw them at the time when I was studying anti-vaccination rhetoric in the print media. And I've seen them continued through social media. But it is certainly interesting to watch how social media has created, I think, even further polarization around vaccination, because people can shoot from the hip. They can speak in a very unfiltered way, whether they be very against vaccination or very for vaccination as well. And what we find is that there are these parents sitting in the middle of this who might be hesitant about vaccination, have questions, and they kind of get lumped into the anti-vax camp and shouted down, which then can drive some of them further away into that camp and marginalise them further.
So what's the best strategy for dealing with these ideas then, if arguing back actually sort of can solidify or reinforce beliefs? How do you deal with it?
So you've really got to think about who you're talking to. You know, I think of the story of Enid, right? So Enid's this young mum. She's just starting to turn to natural health and wanting to raise her children very healthily. And she starts to become quite entrenched in these rather radical views that she needs to avoid toothpaste because it's got fluoride. She needs to avoid all medicines, conventional medicines, and she needs to avoid vaccination for her 4 children. And Enid's actually my grandmother, right? So she would never have changed. So to try to convert somebody like that back to agreeing with vaccination would be impossible, and you would be wasting your time to do so. You're better off focusing on the common ground. Whereas you think about someone like June, who ends up seeing a doctor because her son's hit his head and she's concerned about tetanus, and the doctor sees that none of these 3 boys she has are vaccinated, and is aghast and says, you really need to rethink this. And she does, and she ends up vaccinating. And that's my mum, right? So my mum, raised by Enid to not vaccinate, ends up vaccinating because she was having second thoughts already, but then a health professional recommended vaccination to her. And she had time to think about it, and she had that bridge back to the health professional. So they're just 2, nice sort of narrative examples of people who will remain fixed, one who changes. And they're pretty unusual for parents who start off not vaccinating at all. But then there are people, whether it be in relation to their child's vaccination or their own vaccination, are just really hesitant and have a lot of questions and concerns. And they're worth investing time with. So you've really got to pick your battles and not even see them as battles, but see it as an engagement with somebody that's respectful, because you will not change people through shouting them down or shouting science louder. And some people you will not change at all. You will in fact probably entrench their beliefs, because by virtue of them rehearsing and defending their position, they start to crystallize their arguments even more. So it's really about knowing your audience.
That's interesting. I guess everybody on this panel either works, in or with universities. And so we're all from environments where we're taught to make our decisions really based on weighing evidence. Now, I think we would all agree that the evidence for sort of the anti-vaccination views is somewhere between weak and non-existent. So how is it that people come to these views? Like, is there another susceptibility to that way of seeing things that makes these ideas attractive, or is it about belonging to that sort of community that's defined in opposition to something else? Like, what sort of is the driver underneath it for these beliefs, given that they run so strongly counter to evidence?
Well, I'm sure Carmen will talk to this, but there are a bunch of core values often at the heart of rejection of vaccination. Sometimes it's not about the vaccine. It's about a bad experience with the health system, which makes someone lose trust in that system, or it's about the feeling that government is impinging on my liberty and my choice, or it's a fear of, polluting the body of the child with these synthetic chemicals as they're portrayed as being vaccines. And sometimes it's about grief. You know, with the MMR autism scare, there were a bunch of parents out there who really did believe that vaccines caused their child's autism, and they were grieving and they were seeking a way to make sense of what was happening. They had this causal hunger. What caused this? Vaccines came along. Wakefield popularised that notion with his Lancet paper. And so it's complicated, but what we're finding in our research with parents who don't vaccinate is that they either start with a belief system that's quite, alternative to begin with in terms of health and parenting in general. So vaccination just rides along with that identity. Or they have this bad experience with the healthcare system and come to reject vaccination based on that experience. Or they're just extremely vigilant and they're making intensive decisions about everything to do with their child, and it just so happens that vaccination and researching it gets rolled up into that hypervigilance and unfortunately turns into vaccine rejection.
Perhaps this is a good point at which to bring in Carmen. What can you tell us about what your research has found about the ideas that sort of drive these beliefs across different areas, so like anti-vaccination, climate change denialism, other conspiracy theories, and what we can do about them?
It's a very difficult question, actually, because there's a huge amount of research crossing a range of disciplines: psychology, sociology, history, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves that conspiracies and misinformation, in a sense, are nothing new. The mechanisms may be, as both Steve and Julie have indicated, but the underlying psychological drivers, I think, are fairly common across history and probably across these various conspiracies, although that's less clear in the case of COVID-19, which we're dealing with now. But there are a couple of things that I think I could point to, and one is the fact that there are some common features, if you like, of vaccine hesitant beliefs, for instance, particularly around COVID, to the extent that we know about it, and conspiracy theories in general. So these things are kind of interlaced almost from the outset. Firstly, that the people who believe that COVID-19, for instance, is a conspiracy and is not based on a proper assessment of viral infection, but rather some other nasty intervention, probably by a government, those two things tend to go together. They mistrust the people who entertain those views, scientific research. They tend to reject science and scientific findings. They find alternative explanations. They're looking for patterns often where none exist. This is, I think, characteristic of people who embrace conspiracy theories particularly. And there's been some research to show that people, when they're shown completely random events, differ in the extent to which they try to impose patterns on those random events. Either a pattern that suggests there is some form to it, or agency. And there's some similarity between people who assign agency, for instance, in relation to spiritual beliefs, that there's a greater God, a spiritual force, and those who entertain the more bizarre conspiracy theories. I'm not saying they're the same people, but the same processes are often involved, finding patterns where the rest of us don't see them. Not everyone, of course, in the vaccine hesitancy group will buy into the conspiracies, by the way. As Julie is indicating, some of it comes from understanding, emotion, etc., that is unique to that individual. But the other thing is that it's important, I think, to look at conspiracy theories as they emerge in societies. And we will have seen in Australia that we are not nearly as conspiratorial as those in the United States. Is there something about our society and New Zealanders, for instance, that led us to be more accepting of the official versions of what COVID-19 was and what we needed to do about it? Because it was quite remarkable that Australians of all political persuasions, of all backgrounds and all dispositions appeared willing to accept government and scientific advice on this question. Whereas right from the get-go in the United States, you found considerable difference between people in their willingness to accept the official explanations and advice, particularly along partisan lines, but not exclusively, so that you get the Democrat-Republican polarisation more marked there and around this question. And the conspiracy theories, of course, too, also attributed blame to one or other of those groups. So there are social differences as well. In Australia, about 13% or so of people entertained various of the conspiracy theories. So it's not insignificant. So, for instance, the COVID-19 virus was engineered and released from a Chinese laboratory. About 39% of Australians agreed with that. That was a high percentage. Down to the 5G wireless network conspiracy, only 12% agreed with that. And that was a few weeks ago. So these beliefs are held fairly widely in our society by a minority, and those people tend to have characteristics that lead them to both embrace conspiracy theory and to be anti-COVID vaccination, as far as we can see. Those conspiracies are highly dependent, and the beliefs highly dependent on the way they engage with social media, and I won't go into that because that's already been discussed. But they're also related to the way people generally think, and I've touched on this, that they have a greater tendency to engage in so-called system one reasoning, jumping using heuristics and biases, an emotional kind of tone to the level of understanding, an unwillingness, as I say, to embrace scientific explanations. And this is a general tendency on the part of those people who embrace conspiracy theories and who resist advice on things like vaccination. And in a recent study that looked at both US and Polish subjects, they asked people to consider a series of documents in which they were frightened, if you like, into thinking about COVID-19. They were reading these extracts and compared with control groups. And in that circumstance, when they were then asked their opinions about politics and who they would likely vote for in the coming elections in both Poland and the US, when they were frightened by COVID-related information, they were more likely to move in a conservative direction than when there were controlled information placed in front of them, just sort of neutral information. So there's suggestions there that it's possible to move people in a crisis toward more conservative bent. We already know that people who are conservative politically, who are ideologically interested in control and trying to interpret a world, as Stephan said earlier, where they can understand what's going on, seek explanations of that kind, that they're more likely to engage in conspiratorial thinking and to object to scientific explanations of COVID-19. There's a whole literature on the ideological bias, if you like, in willingness to accept some of the more bizarre theories.
Okay, so what does that mean in terms of what we do about it?
Well, I mean, I think Julie has touched on this, and Steve as well. I mean, it's partly about making sure that information, and Steve's done a lot of work on this, so he should really talk to this, the sort of preparing people for, if you like, an understanding of the science, a willingness to embrace logical thinking, to slow down, because all of us embrace some conspiracy theories, which sometimes turn out to be correct. They're conspiracies, not theories, and sometimes we are subject to misinformation when we jump to conclusions. That's a very important phrase, I think. It's that so-called system one thinking, where we're being intuitive, we're responding emotionally, we're not thinking through, we're not deliberative. So preparing people, and it's interesting that education does have an effect on whether people embrace conspiracies by and large. It's not a huge effect, but it's there. And you find that people who are, if you like, under more stress are more likely to embrace conspiracy theories as well. So being understanding about the sorts of stresses that people face and not demonising them, as Julie's indicated. I saw a paper just this week on the demonisation, if you like, of people who don't vaccinate, and it can be pretty hairy. The anti-vaxxers are very critical of those people who promote vaccination, but equally, those people who embrace vaccination can be very disapproving and in quite vivid terms of those who don't. And I'm sure that that's understood, and it polarises the community even further. So trying to understand why people might be doing this rather than, if you like, berating them for being idiots. Certainly no one likes to be called stupid.
Okay. So speaking of berating people, you touched on something which I think many of the audience for this session were interested in, which is people are really interested in the fact that, as you said, the Australian population has been quite ready to accept the advice of experts around COVID-19. However, there is still a very strong strain of denialism around climate change. Is there anything that in your research that can explain that distinction? If you are saying that Australians are in many ways ready to trust authority on certain issues, why that issue in particular has been such a difficult one?
Well, I think that the very real difference, and this is not based on any kind of careful assessment, but rather my own opinion in this case, is that in the case of COVID-19, there was an alignment of forces. All the leaders and the scientific advice were saying the same thing, and strongly and forcefully. And even though there might have been some disagreement, in the fine detail, and the science, in inverted commas, is really a fiction, it's an agreed position after examining the best that you have available. But the state and federal leaders were on the same page. The scientific advice was clear. The scientists in the community were by and large supported. So everyone was riding in the same direction. On climate change, sadly, we've had a decade of political polarisation, with one side of politics completely abandoning any pretense to embrace the science, and the scientists, in a sense, being caught in the middle of that debate. And of course, a whole lot of forces, and we always have to ask, who benefits from, in the case of other denial or conspiracy, who benefits? And there are a lot of people who benefit from denying climate change, and many of them have funded quite expensive and extensive efforts to undermine the scientists and the leaders who are proposing the need for change. That's been less true with COVID-19 so far, although you have to say in the United States there have been people who've benefited, as Steve was saying, because they get all these people on their sites and they get money from being influencers, and they sell products as well. I think one of the big COVID-19 deniers there was outselling some phony remedy, and the same is true here in Australia. One of the anti-vaxxers was also a COVID-19 denier who was selling some vibratory machine, but he was, had up for misleading advertising, so at least that was shut down. So I think there's a big difference in the profile of political polarisation in Australia on those two issues. Whereas in the US, unfortunately for them, the polarisation has bled into the COVID-19 crisis as well.
It's interesting, actually. I was reading an article recently by the political commentator Bernard Keane, who writes for Crikey, and he was talking about conspiracy theories, and he said, Australian conspiracy theorists no longer bother with Australian-made conspiracies. They use fully imported ones, almost always bearing the proud Made in the USA label. Is that true? Do you think most of our conspiracy theories are imported? Stephen, maybe that's one you could answer.
Well, I don't know. I can't answer that. Although, yes, of course, the United States is a hotspot for conspiracy theories. And in the case of COVID, I think most of the theories have an American origin. For example, the 5G idea, and also that recent movie that was claiming that this was all sort of man-made. The originators are American. And I think what Carmen has done is to point to the reasons for this, which is the intense polarization in the United States, which is now, there is some evidence to suggest that the polarization along party lines in the United States is even greater than it is along racial lines. And if you look at recent events, that's kind of, that's saying a lot because of the, continuing racism in the United States. But party identity overrides even that. That is how strong the polarization is. And of course, then, anything that comes along becomes polarized when, it doesn't have to. So I think Carmen's point about the differences between Australia and the United States is spot on. And we've actually found that in our research in a slightly different context, where we, colleagues and I, Uli Ecker at UWA was one of the lead people in this. We presented participants with statements by politicians that were either true or false, and then we corrected them afterwards. Now, the point of doing this was to see whether that affects participants' liking for the politicians or their intent to vote for them. And what we manipulated was the number of falsehoods relative to the number of truths that we presented participants and that were ascribed to the various politicians. Now, in a nutshell, what happened was that in Australia, if people find out in our experiments that they're being lied to by politicians, they don't like that at all, even if it's their own party. And Australian participants will say, whoa, no, I don't like this guy. No, I'm not going to vote for him, effectively. You run the same study in America with American politicians, same manipulation, you know, you vary the number of falsehoods relative to truths. You ask participants how they feel about Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, would you vote for them? And the answer is, yeah, sure. You know, the accuracy of politicians in the United States has absolutely no effect on how people feel about them. There's a number of experiments that have shown that from different labs, and you can just look at Donald Trump's approval ratings. You know, he's making false statements at the rate of 15 a day throughout his entire presidency. You know, that's documented. 20,000 falsehoods. And it has no effect to his approval ratings. I mean, they go up and down a little bit, but basically they've remained flat because people are in the United States are not concerned with accuracy. They're more concerned with political identity and what I call authenticity, which is that another interesting thing, if you ask Republicans whether Donald Trump is honest, then 3/4 of them will say, oh yeah, he is honest. How can they say that? Well, I think it's because they feel that he's authentic, that he's speaking his mind, he says whatever he feels in the moment. And that is an extremely attractive thing to do under certain circumstances. And I think it also explains why people are susceptible to conspiracy theories. They tend to be similar people, and that is because it is speaking to their intuition and their feelings, as Carmen has mentioned. The people who believe in conspiracy theories tend to be the one who rely on intuition as a means to discern the truth. And of course, Donald Trump and all the other populist politicians around the world are entirely out to appeal to people's emotion and intuition. And so I think we have to understand that underlying demand in a society to varying degrees to have people speak to intuition and to be authentic rather than honest. And Australia is very lucky in that here, well, I should say there because I'm in the UK, but in Australia, people are more inclined to rely on evidence still.
I heard a very interesting interview with the American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who was talking about the work he's done on partisanship in the US. And he was saying basically, Stephen, what you were saying, which is that people often have a predisposition towards a certain type of belief. And what they're looking for is evidence that gives them permission to hold the belief, not sort of assessing evidence in a certain way, so that there is a underlying desire driving the belief formation. Now, one thing that's interesting is that there's been a lot written and said in recent years about the declining trust in politics, politicians, our political system. Some people, particularly those on the left, are very critical of sort of neoliberalism and neoliberal government, and they're saying that there's a broader sense in which people have been alienated from their membership of a political community or their role in a political process that makes them quite susceptible to these us and them ideas that give them a sense of belonging. I'm just wondering if anybody else on the panel could comment on that, and if you think that is true, or if you think that's a sort of partisan view.
Look, I think that there has been, if you look at Australia, for example, a decline in trust in political institutions and figures that's been measured over 20, 30 years in the various surveys that are done regularly after elections and from time to time by others. But I think what was interesting is that I'm now reviewing some of those findings because I think they are based on ephemera. If I can put it this way, I mean, the difficulties we've had with leadership at a national level, particularly in the last 10 years, the sort of revolving door of leaders, has led to a very visible decline in trust. But the moment there was a serious threat to people's well-being, both their health and their social and economic well-being, there was a reconsideration. And partly that was driven by fear, certainly. But even as the threat the immediate threat of illness and death from COVID-19 has retreated, that trust has been sustained. Now, it will disappear again, I think, as people become irritated with the behaviour of politicians in particular. But it showed me, I think, that these phenomena have to be treated with some care. In Western Australia at the moment, the Premier is enjoying support at the level of 90% of the population. And I'm sure you won't mind me saying it, but my brother, who is a very conservative and typical Liberal voter, now thinks that the state Premier here can do no wrong. Now, I don't imagine that will last forever, but when people have their fate in their hands, and they behave responsibly, that trust is immediately, and dramatically restored. And that, I think, represents a challenge for our political leaders to sustain that through what is now probably a more complex set of adjustments in the economy and in a sense, getting people back to something resembling a normal life. But they have been, in a sense, they've earned and they've been given a very substantial gift of trust. And trust is one of those things that underpins all of this, I think. Trust in medical advice, trust in institutions, trust in leaders. And the Jacinda Ardern example, I think, is a good one of where she has managed to garner enormous trust in her and her government over a series of crises, not just the COVID-19, with the effect that you get the feeling that New Zealanders feel really good about themselves at the moment. It's not just that they trust her and trust the government, but they feel good that they as citizens have been partners in this process. And that means that they're more likely to listen to advice on most things which are evidence-based and carefully presented to them, with empathy and sympathy as well.
Julie, you were saying before that you think the idea of arguing with people who have strong anti-vaccination beliefs is perhaps flawed, and a better approach is sort of more empathetic, understanding, accepting, trying to find points of agreement. I'm just wondering whether there might be a pitfall in that approach in terms of the actual value of truth in our sort of political discourse. It seems to me that what we've been talking about is the way in which technology, particularly online social media, has created an attention economy in which truth is somewhat devalued. As long as people are interested and enjoying the content, it's sort of driven by that engagement rather than by, perhaps you could argue, a different sort of public sphere that was very much policed in terms of its accuracy and information. I'm just wondering, do you think that there's a way in which we can both sort of insist on truth and accuracy but still be empathetic and effective at winning people over?
Yeah, there absolutely is. I think in many ways part of this problem that we face with misinformation and dealing with conspiratorial thinking or dealing with beliefs that may have a negative effect on the health of others or on climate, for example, is that we as the critics of these problems need to examine ourselves and our own fast reflexive thinking about the problem. And there's this sense that it's all made very binary. So, you're either for vaccines or against them. Vaccines are, people will be told occasionally by politicians, vaccines are safe, there's no problem with them. And the average punter knows that's not the case, that like any medicine, vaccines carry with them some side effects. Occasionally have very serious but very rare serious reactions to vaccination. So in a sense, vaccination vaccinology as a science is complicated. We do deal with uncertainty with vaccination. What I can say, being immersed in the science of it for 2 decades, is that the overwhelming evidence is that the benefits outweigh the risks. But that doesn't mean that there is not in some fields of vaccination levels of uncertainty and safety issues that need to be acknowledged. And so when we talk about we have the truth, and there are these people who refuse to believe the truth, I don't think it's helpful to think of it in that really binary way. And in fact, some research by a colleague of mine, Cornelia Betsch in Germany, has found that if you say there's no risk, people become more risk averse than if you acknowledge some risk. So it's part of the issue is going with what the science overwhelmingly says about vaccines, and also working with someone's beliefs and their core values. And there's a real art to that. Some of the work we've done around this is to develop communication tips for healthcare professionals to have conversations with parents who either reject vaccination or are very hesitant. And what we recommend is that you start with them talking more than you as a health professional. So you ask them questions. If they're indicating, signalling that they're hesitant or they're not going ahead, then finding out where they're at, eliciting their concerns and questions to saturation, summarising them, setting a brief agenda. And once you've done that and you've agreed with the parent on the agenda, you've already honoured their desire for choice and autonomy in the choice to have a conversation about vaccination. And then you're more likely to bring them along with that conversation, which might head towards vaccination if possible. And that's about gauging whether they're ready for that. And then saying, can I share with you some information that I have? My perspective as a health professional, as someone who's studied this, is that in fact, you know, they looked into this link with autism and it was thoroughly debunked. And here's some information I have for you from the talking about immunization.org.au website that we developed, which is a kind of an adjunct to that conversation to bring in the facts as we best know them today, so that you've got both that listening, engaging discussion, and you've got the facts that you've brought in that are designed in a way that's based in the evidence around debunking that Steve has, you know, made a major contribution to with his colleagues. And that gives me confidence that you can both engage with someone where they're at, but also bring in the best quality evidence that we have around vaccination to try to at least get them to reconsider their decision or to move them towards vaccination.
Okay, I might actually come to that evidence on debunking in a minute because I'm really interested in that research. But before we move on, I just wanted to ask you one more thing, which is you mentioned before we were speaking that you object to the term, or you don't like the term anti-vaxxer. Could you explain why that term's problematic and what your thinking is around it?
Yeah, it tends to be this label that stereotypes anyone from the person who's just merely kind of on the fence to the conspiracy theorist. And they're all just lumped into this one category that is littered with stereotypes that don't have a lot of empirical basis to them, having researched vaccine refusal for a long time and anti-vaccination activism. And the parents that we talk to who don't vaccinate in our research say to us that they find that term really just a very negative label, because it comes with so much baggage. It's like the new group that we all love to hate, right? So if you have made a careful, considered, what you see to be a consistent, considered decision to not vaccinate your child, which you think is based in your research and evidence, even if I, as a public health person, don't agree with it, you can really resent this label that you're just an anti-vaxxer. And I know that anti-vax activists will say, oh, we're not anti-vax. Well, hell, they are. You know, that's really obvious by their actions and their rhetoric. But the parents who don't vaccinate, who may be fairly quiet about their decision, find this label alienating, and it's not going to engage them. So I think we just need to be more empirical about the language we use and pass it out and give it more nuance than we have in the public conversation now.
Okay. So that actually raises this other interesting question, which is what's the effective way of sort of debunking misinformation or arguing against beliefs that, you know, we believe are mistaken in some way? It's a question I'm really interested in because as the editor of a website that published for many years a fact check product, we've done a lot of picking up things that we think are factually incorrect and publishing correct information. It's always seemed to me that that type of project, by its very nature, means that you're preaching to the choir. You're really speaking to people who already sort of share your beliefs. And to some extent, what you might do is, by taking an overly combative approach, push people into a corner rather than being effective. It's interesting that now the social media companies like Facebook are not committed necessarily to not publishing misinformation, but they are paying fact checkers. And Craig Silverman, the BuzzFeed journalist who did all that work around fake news, has actually made the point that he thinks that the increase in fact-checking activity might have a negative effect, because what it will do is encourage journalists to raise the profile of a lot of misinformation that people otherwise wouldn't have even come across, to actually sort of turbocharge people that are wanting to inject it into sort of an information ecosystem, while also creating sort of that us and them sort of combative stance that would be unlikely to convince many people. So, Stephan, I know you've done research on this. Can you tell us what the evidence says and how we should think about debunking and its effectiveness?
Yeah, great question. I think the easiest answer is to replace debunking with pre-bunking, which is that what we try to do increasingly is to provide people with information ahead of time before they're exposed to misinformation that makes them more resistant to being misinformed. And that's called variously inoculation or pre-bunking. And there is some fairly good evidence that that works. For example, in the vaccination context, there is a study by Karen Douglas at the University of Kent who showed that if you tell people ahead of time that they may encounter a conspiracy theory about vaccinations, you know, the usual thing about the pharma industry colluding with the government, you know, if you warn people ahead of time that they may encounter that, then subsequent to that, being exposed to that misinformation, that conspiracy theory has very little effect on people's attitudes and intention to vaccinate. And whereas if you reverse the order of this, if you first expose people to the conspiracy theory and then you try to correct that afterwards, then the success of that manipulation is less obvious. So basically, what we're now saying is to try and tell people ahead of time how they will be misled, which is why at the outset I mentioned these markers of conspiracy theories and the fact, for example, that they're incoherent. Well, if you tell people that ahead of time and if you can educate them in detecting incoherence, then our hope is that they will become less likely to endorse a conspiracy theory or to be misled by something that they can recognize to be incoherent. So I think that is undoubtedly the best way forward, if at all possible. Now, obviously, you don't always have control over that. You know, you can't get to people ahead of time all the time. And then when it comes to debunking, again, the crucial thing is to understand that different things work for different audiences. And if we're sticking to vaccinations and conspiracy theories for the moment, it turns out that for the vast majority of people, if you provide corrective information, that does actually have an effect on their beliefs and attitudes. You know, people are sensitive to information. Most people, most of the time, at least a little bit. So we're not wasting our time, if we talk to the public at large, trying to fact check, trying to give them information. The problem is that there are some people, hardcore, committed believers to a cause, for whom that will not work. And I think Julie said already, you know, there are some people where you're wasting your time if you're trying to talk them out of their deeply held, committed beliefs that vaccinations are bad for you. So we have to differentiate between the audience, and just because there's some people for whom, you know, nothing seems to quote unquote work, doesn't imply that we shouldn't be talking to the vast majority of people who are actually to some extent receptive to correction. So in a nutshell, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but in a nutshell, that's how I would characterize it.
Okay, that's somewhat encouraging. But it does make me wonder, with something like a fact check where what you're doing is basically setting yourself up to say that somebody's got it wrong, it then becomes about right or wrong, winning, losing. It sort of is a very polarizing way of presenting the information. I wonder whether, I'm just specifically interested in this question, it's smarter to try to present the positive information in a more neutral way.
Can I just comment on that? Because I think it's a very important point, and it relates to something that Julie had already raised about not polarizing people too much. Now, I think we have to be very careful with this issue because, yes, on the one hand, there's a lot of gray in the world, and there are a lot of things we have to debate, and there are risk trade-offs, even in vaccinations. All those kinds of things are completely true. However, just because gray exists doesn't mean black and white doesn't. And I think that is something that needs to be very clear. There are people out there who are just saying things that are completely false. When Donald Trump says that more people attended his inauguration than anybody else's, that's false. That's not gray. There's nothing gray about it. It was simply a lie. People lie. And when they lie, we have to call them out. I think we have to be very careful that we don't lose track of that simple fact that when people are dishonest, we have to call them out. If we want a functioning democracy, we shouldn't make decisions that are based on claims that are false, that are made up, that are actually lies. So I feel that we have to be careful here. Yes, there's a lot of gray in the world, but sometimes in order for us to productively discuss those gray issues, which we should, we also have to say, hang on, I'm not wasting my time on nonsense. I'm not going to debate the inauguration lies in the case of Donald Trump or pretend that that is gray. Similarly, when Donald Trump says, I was working in the White House while he was in fact golfing in Florida, that's not subject to debate. Let's not discuss this. This is not gray. And to me, that's a very important distinction to make.
Carmen, what do you think about the strategy on sort of debunking? Do you think it's a good idea to take
to a point, but particularly on the question of a harm? If you think about some of the conspiracy theories in history, they have generated enormous harm. The Jewish people have reason to be very concerned about letting conspiracies and wrong ideas pass through to the keeper or be treated as something you debate. Clearly, that isn't the case when groups are singled out, and they often are in conspiracies. If you look at most conspiracy theories, there's some evildoer. That's the nature of it. There's some force for harm out there. And in the case of the Jewish people, they have often been selected through history as the group who does harm. And in the case of Germany and the use of the anti-Semitic trope, if you like, over generations, generating support for Hitler, the consequences were catastrophic. And you can look at examples like that around the world. So they're the cases where conspiracies have to be actively resisted, pushed back, and called out in as vigorous a way as we possibly can. When it comes to misinformation, where people are simply kind of going with the flow, then I think the techniques that both Steve and Julie have talked to you about are important. But we also have to recognise that in some of those, there are also bad actors, and some of the people are not just misinformed and going along because, that looks like their group, that's my family, that if I'm in the wellness industry, then I have to look to resist vaccination. Some of the actors there clearly are engaged in seeking to achieve very often a political outcome. And again, I think it's worth looking at the difference between the content of a conspiracy, if you like, or a misinformation, and the people who are driving it. And that's nowhere more obvious than in the case of climate change. And if you don't address some of these actors in the, if you like, the play of information, then you're going to miss the point entirely about what needs to be done. So yeah, it is very much a matter of who you're talking to. You're talking to individuals who seem to be misguided, who've got other reasons, including a reasonable suspicion of the science. I mean, in the case of COVID-19, for example, we're going to be presented at some point with a vaccination option, which we know has probably been developed on the run And there have already been some missteps, and science is not perfect, as Julie indicates. There's risk associated with it. It's a reasonable question for a thoughtful person to ask, is this safe? And to what extent will I be taking a risk if I vaccinate, as opposed to the public good that is generated by more people being vaccinated? But that's a reasonable thing. On the other hand, if someone's trying to tell you shouldn't get a COVID-19 vaccine, but buy my wonderful product, which is going to protect you and bugger everyone else, then that's something that should be called out.
Yeah. So just on that, on the climate change one, because it's quite interesting, a few audience members sending questions saying basically, look, I don't believe that vaccines are harmful on balance. I don't subscribe to COVID-19 conspiracy theories, but I do have serious concerns about whether human actions are inducing increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example. Those beliefs are quite widespread and often quite reasonably presented by people who make the argument that this is part of a reasonable palette of belief given the reality of scientific uncertainty. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think, pointing to what is a very substantial scientific consensus. This is not a case like the one I mentioned with COVID-19, where there might be some uncertainty about how efficacious a vaccine might be and how good the coverage and what the risks might be. I think there are so many strands of evidence on climate change that it isn't any longer possible to seriously entertain the idea that it's not happening and it's not human-induced. And by the way, most people accept both those propositions. It's a minority who don't accept them, and I'm not suggesting there's anything untoward about that, but the majority, both scientific and community consensus, at least in a country like this, is that climate change is real, it's a serious problem, and we should be addressing it. So for those people who don't think so, I guess all we can do is to invite them to continue to look at the evidence, to talk to people who have been, assiduously assembling that evidence for a very long time. And, in a way, perhaps even shamelessly point to the fact that they are now in a minority, and why might that be? To get them to examine why it is they're holding steadfastly to a set of propositions that, in their case, constitute belief, and in the case of those people who understand that climate change is occurring, constitute willingness to accept the evidence. I get infuriated in a way, and I do it myself sometimes, when people talk about believing in climate change. It's not a question of belief, actually. It's a question of accepting the evidence that's been presented over now decades by a great many people, where those people, like the medical professionals that we listened to during the COVID-19 event, agree. And if you believe it's not happening, then you're the one that's got a belief rather than acting on the basis of fact.
Without wanting to turn this into a media ethics discussion, it does raise a really interesting question, because the existence of those dissenting beliefs in the community journalistically might imply an obligation to give those beliefs greater airtime or greater coverage. The counter argument you could make is that your coverage is dictated by the preponderance of the science. But given there is such a strong strain of denialist beliefs still, there are many people who would claim, for example, that it's irresponsible not to be debating climate science on every TV program at every opportunity. Stephan, I know you're really interested in this topic. Do you have a thought on how we can best navigate that? Because it's one thing that, for example, the conversation gets criticised for, because we said we're not going to publish misinformation around climate science. And people basically say, well, you're not representing the range of views.
Well, good. So you shouldn't. You're probably also not representing, to pick up on Carmen's case, you're probably not representing anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists, including Holocaust deniers, on the conversation. I mean, there are certain things that you're not representing. And the question then becomes one of, well, how should we determine what to represent? And I think in the case of climate change, there's first of all overwhelming evidence for the scientific consensus. I mean, there simply is no scientific debate to be had. So whatever debate is going on about climate change is entirely political. It is not scientific about the fundamentals of the science, number one. Number two, what we also know, and there's also a huge amount of evidence out there, is that the descent in climate change is organized, and it is driven by ideology. It is driven by vested interests. I mean, there's lots of scientific work done by sociologists on the organized denial that climate science has been confronted with. This is not organic. This is not a grassroots movement. This is completely organized by vested interests. In the United States, sociologist Robert Broly has written a paper where he traced $1 billion a year that go into an organized network of right-wing think tanks, many of which have a climate denial component to them. So we have evidence, an abundance of evidence that we're facing an organized political campaign to deny the science. So if you want to represent those views, sure, by all means, tell people where they come from and why they're organized, and that Exxon, in fact, knew in the 1970s that climate change was real, but then continued to fund organized denial to deny the science for their own commercial purposes. And the list just goes on and on and on and on. I mean, there's no shortage of evidence you can talk about to explain where climate denial comes from. And I think that would be the right position to take because it is evidence-based. And I think in general, this connects to what I was saying before about, gray exists and we should debate that. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we also have black and white. We have to get over this idea, I think, that any opinion automatically entails the right to be represented. I find that actually really weird that we got to that point in society where we think that's the case. No, I do not believe that every single opinion one can hold has the right to be represented in the media. As a scientist, it would be absurd for me to express an opinion just because I feel like it. I can't do that. I have to support it by argument or by data. I have to justify my opinion. It has to be evidence-based. Of course it has to be. And so I think, we have to kind of renegotiate this sort of terrain of are you really entitled to your opinion? And I think the answer should be, well, no, unless you can support it by evidence. And the moment you apply that criterion, I think you can have a meaningful conversation about lots of gray areas where we do have to have a debate.
Okay. So, Julie, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, just with vaccination, we've seen tremendous harm done with the false equivalence that was applied to the MMR autism scare in the UK in the late 90s and early 2000s. And the media gave it this 50-50 airing. It gave a very sympathetic line to this very, very limited study that, didn't even show really any evidence of a link between vaccines and autism, but was popularized by Wakefield. And that was that false equivalence was really harmful. But what we have in Australia now is that we have media organisations who will, through the lobbying efforts of some, have become very careful not to give anti-vaccination arguments or activists a sympathetic line. But what does happen is they report their activities. So we've got, this vaxxed tour bus going through Queensland at the moment. And the news channels are wanting to report this as a story. What I think that does, even if they report it sanctimoniously, is give it a whole lot of free publicity that, I think is not necessarily helpful. It oxygenates the anti-vaccination activists. It gives their messages more attention, even if it's done in a kind of against frame. So I think that it's not just a case of, not giving sympathetic 50-50 coverage to both sides when it should actually be 97% to 3%. But we also need to be careful about how much we cover anti-vax arguments, even with moral outrage, because it gives them more oxygen and attention and thousands of dollars of free publicity.
Okay. That actually
point out that the social media there are critical, because even if the so-called mainstream media are not giving it coverage, and they do, as Julie said, often cover the events, where maybe 20 or 100 people turn up and suddenly it's a major media event. But on social media, the coverage has been enormous, and I saw some figures presented by the ABC recently in one of their articles showing a massive increase in the amount of coverage on social media that was being given to particularly the anti-vaxxers' arguments, and increasingly around COVID-19. So I think that's the space to watch. There's a linkage, as one observer put it, between now the health industry and the alt-right, particularly in the United States. So they're coalescing, and some of the same people who are rabid in both fields are now in harmony, so to speak, and harnessing a much wider online audience. So I think there's a lot going on there that probably the mainstream media aren't even picking up on.
This is interesting because it's the same, really, as the amplification effect, which is what Craig Silverman was talking about, this idea that if you're paying all these people to, for example, search out misinformation that can be attributed to Russian misinformation campaigns, what you're doing is some of that misinformation maybe never would have reached audiences at all, and you're actually just amplifying it in a way that's not very helpful. Yeah. Julie, there was a question from one of our audience members that I thought was just really interesting, quite basic one, which was, is there any advice that you have about how to talk to family and friends who might have a belief that you believe is a conspiracy theory, mistaken, say, around vaccination or COVID or something? What's the best, basic interpersonal communication strategy?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because I actually think the first task of a person who encounters a belief that's really, really different from your own, and it's from someone you care about, is to manage your own emotions around it to begin with. Because we might want to, I do this too, you want to reflexively jump in and right that wrong thinking. And it's if that person is quite fixed, it's not going to make a difference. So you've got to then decide, do I go there at all? Family, so as you guessed, members of my extended family are against vaccination, and we get together for an event, a family event. Do we go there at all? Well, we don't actually. And I've even said at one point, look, I can see we're going to end up in vaccination, and we know that we have really strong views here and we just want to get along. So I vote we leave this topic alone. And they all agreed wholeheartedly, because we just wanted to enjoy each other's company. I knew that I was never going to change them. But sometimes it can be really important. So there might be someone who just will not vaccinate, and you want them to vaccinate because there's a newborn baby in the family, for example. And then there has to be some kind of a negotiation. And so it's about hearing them out, understanding where they're coming from, trying to understand what the values are at the core of that belief, acknowledging them and validating them, and saying, look, can I share my views? As like I was saying before, this is my position, and this is actually an important issue because our differences here might have implications for X, Y, and Z. Can we come to some kind of compromise here? Or how should we choose to interact over this topic in the future? But it's really about choosing your battles, and I don't think, if it's not going to change someone's health or well-being, that belief, trying to not let it come in the way of that relationship.
One other question that actually people have been asking is, a few librarians have written to us talking about this idea of media literacy skills, how you can teach people to decode information, tell what's trustworthy, debunk misinformation. I must admit, I always feel quite ambivalent when I hear that term, because I remember it being championed by Google and Facebook a few years ago, and I sort of thought to myself, you've been responsible for putting all of this misinformation and misleading content all in with quality information in the one sort of jumble, and now basically you're turning around to the audience and saying you need to learn how to sort it out. So it always struck me as a bit of a cop-out in some ways. I feel like the people who are publishing should take some responsibility as well. But I'd love to hear from any of the panelists about what you think we can do in terms of increasing people's media literacy and giving them the skills to decode information.
I saw a report recently. I was interested in this because, you know, years ago there was this publication called Crinkling News, which was designed to engage young people in producing news and publishing it. And it was a lovely idea that was also committed to improving media literacy of young people. And there are some efforts in high schools to improve the media literacy of young people. And I think that's actually the place to start, because what there's been with this focus on misinformation, a turn to the audience and equipping audience members with the skills to critically appraise what they're hearing, and, you know, giving them, for example, some of those tools of recognition like the work of Steve and colleagues has done, can be really useful. So I think there's some exciting work happening in that area. It's not, you also do have to address the source of the problem of misinformation, but helping the audiences become critical is going to be good if you accept the premise that this whole sort of whack-a-mole thing where you stop this bit of misinformation and up pops another bit isn't going to work. Then let's focus on the audience and building their critical appraisal skills.
Has anybody else got thoughts on that?
I agree. I mean, it's an old-fashioned idea. The universities once used to pride themselves on training young people to be critical thinkers. I think an embrace of that idea, a re-embrace of that idea, I'm not saying it doesn't happen today, but it is less in focus, if you like. And to talk about media literacy is one thing, but to be a good critical thinker, to be able to examine arguments, to examine the, if you like, the whole profile of a point of view that's being put to you in a way that's rigorous and careful, whether it's scientific or historical or economic. I mean, each discipline has its own set of tools, but absolutely critical for a well-informed society. And I think, in a sense, we've taken the focus of that and allowed, I suppose, in a postmodern kind of way, every idea to flourish no matter what its genesis, whereas I think critical thinking knocks some propositions out really at the first square, because it doesn't stand up to the reasonable assessments that critical thinking requires. So proper education right from day one, and improved science literacy too. I mean, it's surprising how many people don't understand how scientific investigations are conducted, and they cherry pick data and they put things together that don't belong together. And it's not because they're necessarily willful, but because they haven't had the training. It's a great privilege when people have that training, but it should be a generally available skill. And if you look at our primary schools in particular, I think it's often not the case that young kids are getting that sort of education early enough.
Stephen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with the need for critical thinking, absolutely. My only added comment would be that I think university is too late and too selective to teach those skills, and that we have to start much sooner, and like in high school or even in primary school. And it turns out that there is some work at Stanford University where people have looked at training high school students in simple things like, how do you assess the trustworthiness of a website? And it turns out that what students do, I mean, what untrained people and students, all of us, if we don't know how to do this, we tend to look at the website and try to click on links and find out who these people are and what they say about themselves to evaluate their credibility. Now, professional fact checkers, it turns out, do something completely different. They never look at the website they're trying to check out. What they do instead is to search for that website on Google, and they open like 10 or 12 tabs of other sources talking about the website. They're searching in a breadth manner rather than in a depth process within the website. And it turns out that if you do that, you have a much greater chance of uncovering the credibility of that website. Because if you come across Snopes or some other debunking site saying, hey, the guys you're looking at, they're whatever, they're making stuff up, then you can pick that up elsewhere, but not on the website itself. that's, you know, something really fairly trivial. It takes 3 minutes to learn that and to kind of go, yeah, okay, maybe I should do that. And it has a tremendous effect on high school students once they know that. There are some wonderful YouTube videos out there of students before and after when they're given this task to assess a website credibility, and it makes a huge difference. So there are ways in which we can teach people to be more discerning and more able to pick out when they're being misled. But we have to start it very early. We have to do that in high school and for everybody, not just too late and too selectively in university.
Carmen, before you were talking a little bit about this idea of different orders of thinking, like different ways of thinking, can you maybe explain to me just in a bit more detail what that was about?
Steve is probably your man on this, but I can do a rough approximation of what cognitive psychologists normally understand by System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is where we use all sorts of shortcuts because there's an immediate need to make a decision, it's emotionally fraught, and we need to, in a sense, survive. I mean, it probably does, in an evolutionary sense, stem from those decisions we need to make to protect ourselves. And that tends to be the sort of thinking that people have discovered underpins conspiratorial thinking, seeing patterns where there aren't any, seeing agency where there isn't any. This makes sense when you're confronted with some kind of crisis or difficulty. The other kind of so-called System 2 thinking is deliberative, using the evidence, taking care over assembling various points of view and arguments. It's really, in a sense, you know, psychologists sometimes tell you what to think when you already think it, if I can put it that way. It seems like the bleeding obvious that we have these different ways of responding to the world. And when we are, in a sense, pushed into using System 1 thinking, that reflexive, shortcuts kind of thinking, we tend to make more mistakes. But they're mistakes that may well lead us to survive. You know, it's better to imagine that if you imagine a stick is a snake, then you're probably better off treating it as a snake than making the opposite mistake.
I'm just wondering whether if we recognise and acknowledge that there's a lot of time that human beings spend in System 1 thinking, we actually need to find strategies to get them to the right outcomes when they're in that approach. And it would seem to me that one thing, just touching on something we were talking about before, which was the increase in trust in experts and expertise that we've seen with COVID-19, one sort of shortcut that people use, presumably when they're in System 1, is others that they trust. And I'm wondering if there's any way we can leverage that greater trust in experts and expertise to try to find ourselves in a better position in terms of influencing people's thinking down the track. Stephen, is there sort of anything in that we can do?
Well, certainly it is true that in many countries the COVID crisis has shifted people's attitudes dramatically, and in particular it has led to a loss of popularity of populist politicians in many countries. I mean, in Germany, the AfD is now, you know, down to 8%. They've lost about 8 percentage points. Their support has been cut in half. Salvini in Italy has suffered a similar fate. I think people have sort of, reoriented themselves a little away from these emotive, intuitive slogans and promises towards expertise, which is a good thing, of course. Now, the crucial thing is that we have to build on that and capitalize on that. And I think what it takes for that is that as a community or society, a global society, we really have to think about better ways of managing or interacting with social media, because I don't want to blame social media for everything, but social media is an important component in the crises that we're facing in terms of undermining trust and denial of science. All of that is amplified, at least, by social media. So we have to deal with that. And it's very interesting to me how Facebook has managed to not just identify COVID-related misinformation, but also to deal with it after they said for years and years that, oh, we can't do that, we don't have the technology. Well, funnily enough, this crisis comes along, and all of a sudden, Facebook is quite capable of overlaying misinformation with a gray, opaque mask that is warning people that this content is false. It doesn't prevent people from accessing it. It just makes it harder because they have to click through this warning and they can't really see what's underneath the semi-transparent mask. And that has cut sharing of misinformation by 95%. So, and that was done I mean, Facebook did this in a controlled experiment, but you know, I trust their data. They're smart enough to do that kind of stuff. So that's just one example of how it is possible for social media to make a difference to the spread of misinformation. The real problem is that we don't have any democratic accountability of this or any kind of regulation, nothing that is thought out in a democratic way. It is all Facebook making that decision on their own, or YouTube deciding, you know, to change their policy or their algorithm. And so we have to come to terms with the fact that at the moment, our information diet is determined by, you know, a dozen people in Silicon Valley who are running algorithms that no one really understands. They probably don't understand them themselves. And it's the algorithms that are telling us what to see and what to read. And I think that is something that we just cannot continue to let unfold without accountability. I think that is the crucial next step, to build on the sort of restoration of expertise that we've observed and make sure we carry that forward by actually taking control of what it is that we want as a society to happen on social media rather than 10 guys in Silicon Valley.
Okay. Just one last question, I think, before we wrap up, and that's it's sort of very easy to say that things are worse than they've ever been or that the situation has deteriorated. I'm just wondering if each of our panelists could just give us your sort of assessment of where we're at, if you're optimistic, if you're pessimistic, if you think things are getting worse, if they're getting better, if it's the same as it's always been. I mean, there's been such a huge technological evolution and the change in the way that misinformation spreads that certainly it's quite visible to us in ways that's never been visible before. But I wonder whether things are actually manifestly worse. Maybe we could start with you, Carmen.
Look, I don't know. If you look at the objective data on the state of the planet, I have to say that I'm not wildly optimistic at the moment. But on the other hand, if you look at the state of misinformation and its flow, it's faster, certainly, but is it more effective in generating the problems that we're confronted with, whether it's the health problems associated with COVID, refusal to vaccinate, for example, or climate change? I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think if you look back to my parents and grandparents, I mean, they lived through wars and depressions where societies were turned upside down and where there was plenty of, you know, rumour mongering, as they called it then, and misinformation and conspiracy theories. And as I say, culminating in the case of Germany in the extermination of, you know, great many people, you know, 6 million Jews at least. So is this a worse time for misinformation? I don't know. It feels like it, but that's because I'm here. I wasn't where my parents were or where my grandparents were. We do know from history that there are spikes of misinformation and conspiracy in times of great crisis. I think there's no doubt we're in such a time, and so we're going to see a spike of activity. Is it forever? I don't think so. I think it will return to a kind of baseline if we start to get on top of some of these problems. And I suppose, like most human beings, I remain optimistic, stupidly so in many respects, that we will take more action on climate change, that we will get on top of the economic difficulties we confront, and that we won't continue to trash the planet. But I'm not sure that I'm so optimistic that I can't see the role of misinformation and conspiracy theories in making that a much more difficult task.
Julie, how are you feeling?
It depends on what dimension we're on. I mean, clearly things are getting worse for the planet if we're not going to act on global warming. In terms of vaccination, there's a real tendency to say that, you know, things are really bad now because there's all this misinformation that's stopping people from vaccinate, and that's just a a fallacy of unitary cause. You know, it's more complicated than that. In fact, if that were the case, if the internet and social media influence was prevailing, we'd see lower vaccination rates. In Australia, we've got higher vaccination rates than ever, owing to initiatives like, you know, ones that Carmen brought in, like the introduction of a national register. So I think in terms of vaccination, in some ways, there's nothing new under the sun. And the kind of opposition and the themes that we see in history, we see today. I was surprised by how many people in those polls believed in the sort of 5G conspiracy theories, but understand from my fellow panelists that that's kind of predictable when you've got an uncertain time, and that might settle down a bit. I've been really pleasantly surprised by how much trust and cooperation there's been in Australia around the pandemic, and our ability to control this pandemic has relied on behaviour. We haven't had the technological solutions other than testing, and yet we've done such a great job in controlling the pandemic by virtue of our being able to close our borders, and by what we've done, and our leaders acting early and listening to the experts. So that's really a heartening thing. So it's just, you know, like any academic, I'm never going to answer that question in a simple, clear way.
Worth a try. Stephen, what do you think?
Well, I'm actually, you know, quite optimistic in many ways because of what I've already mentioned, that the COVID pandemic has certainly in Europe and Australia restored some trust in expertise, or at least recognition of the need that you've got to have experts to deal with crises. And I'm also quite encouraged by the way that the European political scene is unfolding, and how the European Commission is presently quite active in exploring options to consolidate democracy in Europe, dealing with misinformation, dealing with social media. There is an ongoing dialogue between the software companies and the European Union, and I think that is pointing in a very promising direction, potentially. Of course, everything can get unstuck at the last moment, but certainly a moment that is looking promising.
Okay. Look, we're almost out of time. We have to leave it there. Does anybody have any last burning point that they wanted to make they haven't had an opportunity to make yet?
I want to make the point that, you know, there is a lot of concern about vaccination rates being influenced by misinformation and anti-vaccination messages and vaccine rejection, but that it needs to be looked at in perspective, and that, you know, globally, the biggest enemy of high vaccination rates is failure of primary care and good service delivery, or vaccine supply issues. So yes, vaccine refusal can be a problem, and activism against vaccination can be a problem in some countries at some points in time. But we need to keep focusing on the other factors that affect uptake of vaccination, like access to healthcare. And governments need to have good data to understand their problems with vaccination before they jump to solutions.
I guess there's a parallel observation to be made about climate change. It's not as if we don't know what needs to be done. It's not as if we don't know how to do it in a way that benefits the society. The problem is that we're not having, in the case of Australia, decision makers who are willing to take those actions. But as Steve says, at least in some parts of the world, there does seem to be a greater willingness now to contemplate what is required. So I guess that's the thing. It's not about the few deniers that are left on the climate change story. It's the fact that too many of them reside in our governments.
Okay, fantastic. Look, we might wrap it up there. Thank you, everybody. That was a terrific, fascinating conversation. I don't know quite where it sort of leaves me in terms of all these really quite complex and vexed questions, but I certainly feel like I know a lot more than when we started. So thank you to Professor Stephan Lewandowski. Thank you to Professor Julie Leask, and thank you to Dr Carmen Lawrence for your time today. And thank you to everybody who sent in questions. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you and goodbye.